Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin. I want to talk about casualties. Do you think 100,000 civilian deaths in 1 year is significant? Oh, it's massive. When you consider we lost about 59,000 men and women in the Vietnam War, when you consider we lost over 50,000 in the Korean War, it's a lot of people. Those were combatants, not civilians, not citizens. So let me ask you a question. When a president of the United States keeps a border open intentionally, the southern border, and upwards of 100,000 young Americans aged 18 to 45 die every single year that border is open from fentanyl, almost 100,000 American civilian casualties. Well, what kind of president is that? Is that a man who gives a damn about human life? Is that a man who's compassionate about the American people? Is that a man who wants to protect the American people? Absolutely silent. He doesn't even talk about it. While his flunky, the Secretary of DHS, keeps testifying that the border is secure or we need comprehensive immigration reform. And I'm not even including the inhumanity, the other inhumanity that's taking place on the border, the sex slaves, the children sold into sex slavery, the rapes, the murders, the other drugs coming across, drug cartels with ties to the communist Chinese who use techniques like ISIS coming into our country. They now have a foothold in every major metropolitan area and in every one of our states. What kind of a president is that? He's a president that should be impeached. That's a high crime. Doing that to your own country? 100,000 civilian deaths a year, probably more. We just had the FBI director testify that the FBI now controls enough fentanyl, illegal fentanyl, that it has acquired to kill 270 million Americans. 270 million Americans, and the border's still wide open, given what's going on in the Middle East? Can you think of another country that has an open border? Any? Can you think of another president or prime minister or dictator or monarch who would leave a border open like that so its own people are suffering and dying? We're talking about potential terrorist attacks. We're going to have them. We all know it. You can't have millions of people coming in here, not vetting them, not even know who they are and where they're going, and assume that the people who want to blow us up, the people who took down the towers, the people who've hit us over and over and over and over again, that all of a sudden they're going to somehow respect the rules of law, or they're not going to sneak across the border. Biden knows it. Harris knows it. The Attorney General knows it. The FBI director is sitting right next to Mayorkas, and he wouldn't even point the finger and say, you need to secure that border. No, he couldn't even bring himself to do that. Why am I telling you this? Because Joe Biden doesn't give a damn about American civilian casualties, as he goes on about civilian casualties in Gaza, as he talks about a humanitarian ceasefire. You know what a humanitarian ceasefire is? It's appeasement. It's appeasement in stages. But appeasement in stages is appeasement. The Israelis cannot afford to lose a war when their very survival is at stake. Ask Hamas. They keep announcing, we're going to keep at it till they're destroyed. Ask Hamas's rioters, protesters, the Hamas network. You see them in the streets. You hear the professors. You see the college students. You even see the media. What do they say as they spew the propaganda of the enemy? As they spew the propaganda of the enemy. The Democrat Party is a problem. The Democrat Party is a party without a soul. It's a party without principle. It's a party without morality. That's why the Democratic Socialists, a.k.a. Marxists who hate America, that's why the Hamas, Nazi-supporting individuals in our country, they're all Democrats. They have representation in Congress. They have representation in Democrat Party organizations. They have representation in the Democrat media. They're not Republicans. They're not constitutional conservatives. They hate us. But I want to talk about civilian casualties because they're trying to now force Netanyahu to resign. MSNBC and Biden and the other, he's weak. He's weak. No, it's Biden who should resign. He should be impeached. A high crime that he's committing against the people of the United States, just the southern border alone. But I want to give us a little bit of history here that I'm sure is not being taught in our schools. The Civil War. The siege of Vicksburg was one of the most tactically important victories for the Union in the American Civil War, writes Aaron O'Neill at Statistica. as it helped give them control of the Mississippi River, while cutting off a major supply line for Union forces. When Major General Ulysses S. Grant's Union troops tried to take the fortress by force in mid-May 1863, they were twice pushed back with heavy casualties. Instead of sending his men to try a third time, Grant had a different idea. He encircled Vicksburg, the second most important military manufacturing city in the Confederacy. One side, the Mississippi River, he sent his massive gunboats. The rest of it, often on a hill, he surrounded it. And what did he do? Night after night, day after day, relentlessly. He prevented anyone from leaving, and he prevented anyone from going in. No ingress, no egress. Citizen, non-citizen, it didn't matter. The inhabitants survived for about 40 days before running out of provisions. They couldn't get any food. Many reports claim the starving inhabitants, mostly citizens, but also military, had to resort to eating dogs and rats in order to survive. Dogs and rats. Some people starved to death. Most were malnourished. It was a horrendous scene. Vicksburg. Was Abraham Lincoln a war criminal? Or was Abraham Lincoln one of our greatest presidents in American history? And let me ask this question. Israel needs to fight to survive. Hamas has said it wants to destroy them. Hamas is backed by Iran. Hamas is backed by Hezbollah. Hamas is now backed by Russia and China. This tiny little Jewish state with 7 million Jews up against it. Do they have a right to fight to win? Not if you listen to Joe Biden. A humanitarian ceasefire? So you can provide food and medicine and fuel that the enemy, Hamas, steals? There's evidence. They're stealing fuel from the hospitals. They're using their people as fodder. The Israelis aren't doing it. The enemy's doing that. But, of course, the American media are all in. Was it really okay for the Israelis to go after one commander who helped lead the slaughter of their people with all the casualties that occurred? Do you think that would have been asked during the Civil War? So here's my question. Abraham Lincoln, in my view, the second greatest president in American history, George Washington the first. Do we revere him? You bet we do. Why? Because he defeated the South, he kept the Union together, and he ended slavery. Well, let me ask you something. 700,000 casualties, 50,000 citizens died. Now, I know it's not as much as the open border that Biden has, with 100,000 Americans dying every year, but 50,000 were killed. Was it worth the battle to keep the nation together and to end slavery? Well, most of us think it was. You see, Lincoln didn't agree with a two-state solution. It was one country, no two-state solution. He could have easily negotiated for a two-state solution. He said, no, it's the United States of America. That's number one. Number two, slavery. Slavery was barbaric. Do we agree? Democrat, Republican? All of us agree? Yes. 700,000 casualties. So when the Israelis fight for their lives, for their survival, is that okay? No. No, they're the aggressor. No, they're the occupier. No, they need to be obliterated. And so they keep trying to pull Netanyahu back. They keep trying to pull the IDF back. Well, it seems to me, if it was good enough to fight, and it should be, and it was, to end slavery, well, it's good enough for the Israelis to fight for their lives and their very survival, and against this whole notion of a two-state solution, which would be their final solution. You want to hear another one? How about the Battle of Atlanta? By 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman had come to believe that a Union victory required not only defeating the Southern armies, listen, but also destroying the South's physical ability and psychological will to continue the war. This was also the case in World War II. World War II is often called the war against civilians. Dresden, Berlin, London, Nagasaki, Hiroshima, all aimed partially at military, but all aimed at destroying the will of the people to support these regimes, all of them. And we were involved in them, big time. Atlanta, a transportation industrial center and symbol of Confederate strength, made a prime target. So what did Sherman do? Well, he marched through Atlanta like crap through a goose. Soldiers set fire to the city, culminating when the troops set much of the downtown area ablaze during the last night in the city. Sherman had carefully studied census records to make sure his troops could live off the land before leaving Atlanta, and to maintain his supply line. The Union soldiers raided farms, destroyed cotton fields and mills, slaughtered livestock, burned properties where they met resistance, and took as much food as they could carry. During the occupation of Atlanta, Sherman wrote to city officials there, "War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it." Years later, he shortened this sentiment during an address at the Michigan Military Academy. War is hell. And we've always viewed it that way, and we've always fought it that way. Two of our greatest presidents, Lincoln and then later Grant, viewed it that way. We would not have this country. We would not have ended slavery if we didn't fight the way we fight. We would not have won World War II and defeated Hitler in the Third Reich, Tojo, the Japanese emperor, and Imperial Japan. We would not have defeated Mussolini and fascistic Italy. We would not have destroyed those concentration camps and all the rest of the brutality that the Axis powers were involved in had we not fought to win. To win. That's our perspective. That should be our perspective. All these calls for the state of Israel, slow down, be careful, don't hit the school, don't hit the hospital. And here we have terrorists, desert rats, hiding among their people. And the Israelis, the only army on the planet that's supposed to fight a war humanely, that's supposed to fight a war and pick out the enemy from the citizen, even though they're wearing the same things, and the enemy knows this and is purposely hiding among the citizens. Joe Biden says he's very concerned about the Palestinian citizens. He's not even concerned about the American citizens. What happened to those Americans in Afghanistan? Hundreds of them left behind. He doesn't even talk about them. They're there because of him. Blinken doesn't even talk about them. Getting the hostages back. I think Biden made it a little more complicated when he handed $6 billion over to the Iranians. I don't want to hear that it wasn't our money. The South Koreans wouldn't have released it without our say-so. They held it back with our say-so, and that money's there for a reason. The Iranians already said they'll do whatever the hell they want to do with it. And the spigot's still wide open. $1.5 billion a week going to the Iranian Nazi regime that's funding Hamas, that's funding Hezbollah, that's funding the Houthis, that's funding the attacks on America. Funding the attacks on America. And he says he's very concerned about the civilian deaths taking place in Gaza. Not Texas, not New York City, no. I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen, this is the worst president in American history. He's causing wars. He's going to cause a disastrous terrorist attack, one or more in this country. He's caused all kinds of harm, and I will say death in our own country already, American citizens. He left citizens behind in Afghanistan. He is a complete and unmitigated disaster. But the Democrat Party has a problem, much bigger than the Republican Party. The Democrat Party, as I've written, it not only hates America, but what is the Democrat Party? The Democrat Party is basically an unprincipled organization that seeks power for those who run it. And that's why you can have in the Democrat Party overwhelming number of Jewish voters, overwhelming number of Muslim voters, overwhelming number of voters who will support and are Hamas versus an overwhelming number of people who support Israel, voting for the same candidates. How can that be? Well, let me ask you. The climate change Marxist fanatics who are destroying our ability to produce oil and coal and natural gas, steel and aluminum, who are hollowing out the industrial heartland of our country. How can the Democrat Party represent working-class Americans, union and non-union, and at the same time represent the psycho-radical left sitting in their office buildings or their Ivy League school offices dictating how they're going to destroy the industrial heartland? How is it that they both vote Democrat? Because they have a corrupt media, a propagandist media with demagogic hosts. The New York Times covered up the Holocaust, and now it is the mouthpiece for it. It is the propaganda wing of Hamas in the United States. Same with our big networks, same with so much of the American media. That's how the Democrats get away with it. That's how Biden gets away with it. And at the same time, they call Republicans and conservatives racists In fact, here we have an article from CNN. White House announces national strategy to combat Islamophobia. Tell me something, ladies and gentlemen. Where are all the marching Jews demanding the obliteration or elimination of Muslims? Where are they? What city are they in? Where are all the universities and colleges promoting Islamophobia? Or are those Jewish students running into libraries and into attics, locking themselves up, fearful for their own lives and violence? Where are all the pro-Israel, pro-Jewish professors, tenured professors, going on and on about how the Muslims are occupiers overseas? But there is Islamophobia, and it's horrific. It's horrendous. It's just not in the United States. It's in the Muslim and Arab countries. More Muslims are being slaughtered and have been slaughtered by other Muslims than anybody else and anywhere else on the face of the earth. And it's going on as I speak. Whether it's Yemen, whether it's Iran, whether it's Iraq, Syria murdered over 500,000 of its own people, Muslims. The Palestinian Authority murders its own people. Hamas murders its own people. Hezbollah murders its own people. It's Muslims slaughtering Muslims. White House announces national strategy to combat Islamophobia. Now, why have they done this? Two quick reasons. One, because part of their base is very upset that Joe Biden gave a speech that he's standing with Israel, which, by the way, he's not. He's doing as little as possible. Mark, he's giving them arms. Every president has provided them with arms. But he's also provided their enemy with $70 billion. Let's see. $3.4 billion versus $70 billion. Seems a little out of whack to me, doesn't it, you, America? But it's even more than that. Their base, as I said. But the Democrat Party has no soul. It has no soul.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.